Imagine standing at the mouth of a limestone cave somewhere in what we now call southern Spain 40,000 years ago. The air is cold but not bitter. A low wind moves across the valley below you, carrying the dry smell of pine needles and old snow. Behind you, deep inside the cave, a small fire crackles softly, sending a slow curl of smoke out past your shoulder into the fading light. In front of you, the world stretches out in long, soft folds of grey and green and pale bone white. Hills of winter grass, stands of dark pine, a river braided into strands of silver and ice. Far in the distance, barely visible against the horizon, a single herd of woolly mammoths moves slowly across an open plain, their russet coats catching what is left of the sun. You're standing with a man. He is not tall. He is shorter than you by half a head, but he is built of something denser than ordinary bone. His shoulders are wide, his chest deep, his arms thick with the quiet power of a lifetime spent walking, lifting, hunting, surviving. His skin is pale beneath a scatter of sun freckles, and his long red-brown hair is pulled back from his face by a strip of sinew. His beard is thick, his hands are scarred in a dozen places, small pale lines where flint edges slipped long ago. His eyes, set deep beneath a heavy shadowed brow, are the soft hazel of wet leaves, and those eyes are looking out at the same valley you're looking at, with an expression that is almost impossible to name. Patient, tired, thoughtful, the expression of someone who has seen a great many winters and expects a few more, but not many more. He is the last of his people in this valley. He does not know that yet. He does not know it in the way you know it, sitting wherever you are sitting now, with the whole of recorded history behind you and the story already written. He knows only what the winter has shown him. He knows the children in the cave behind him are fewer than they were when he was young. He knows the old woman who taught him to knap flint has been gone for 2 summers now, and no one has replaced her voice at the fire. He knows that when he walks to the next valley, the caves that used to smell of wood smoke and tanned hide now smell only of wet stone. He does not have a word for extinction. He does not need one. The disappearance is quiet and slow, and close enough to the rhythm of ordinary loss that it does not yet look like an ending. Tonight, though, you're going to stand beside him for a little while. You're going to walk backward through his life, and through the life of his people, and through the hundreds of thousands of years that Homo neanderthalensis walked this same continent before him. You're going to see the forests they knew, the fires they tended, the bones they laid carefully in the earth, the tools they shaped with astonishing care, the ornaments they strung onto sinew, the stars they watched from the mouths of caves like this one, and then, very slowly, you're going to watch the light go out, not as a tragedy, not as a catastrophe, just as a long, warm story ending the way so many stories end in deep time, with quiet and weather, and time itself doing what time does. Before we begin, settle yourself. Let your shoulders drop. Let the blanket lie heavier on your chest. Let your breathing slow to match the pace of the wind at that cave mouth. There is nothing to hurry toward in this story. The last Neanderthal is not going anywhere tonight. You do not need to keep up. You only need to listen and drift and let the deep past come to meet you. Somewhere in the world it is late. Somewhere in the world it is always late. Close your eyes if you'd like, or let them rest half open on whatever is in front of you. I'll be here carrying the story for as long as you need. Here is the strange, quiet thing about the Neanderthals. For nearly 300,000 years, they were the dominant human beings of Europe and Western Asia. 300,000 years. Think about that number for a moment. Modern humans, the ancestors of everyone alive today, have only existed as a fully recognizable species for about that same span. Our whole recorded history, from the first scratched mark on a cave wall to the device you are listening to this on, is a thin skin at the very top of an enormous layered cake of forgotten time. And for most of that cake, the people walking the European valleys, building the fires, burying the dead, raising the children were not us. They were them, Neanderthals. A different branch of the human family with different faces and different bodies and almost certainly different songs, but not less intelligent, not less loved, and not less worthy of being remembered. And then, very slowly, over perhaps 10,000 years, they were gone. Not killed in a single battle, not wiped out in a single plague, not drowned in a single flood. Just gradually thinned, generation by generation, across an entire continent, until the last family and then the last small group, and then, eventually, the last individual closed their eyes for the last time in a cave somewhere, Perhaps in southern Iberia, perhaps in the Caucasus, perhaps in a limestone overhang whose name will never be known. And the human family lost a whole branch of itself forever. That is the story we're going to sit inside tonight. Not the loud version, the quiet one, the true one, as far as the bones and the stones and the ancient DNA have been willing to tell us. Step back from the cave mouth for a moment. Walk with me through a slow door in time. It is now roughly 400,000 years ago. Europe looks different. The glaciers are in a different place. The coastline of Britain is not an island yet. There are hippos in the Thames and lions in France and straight tusked elephants browsing the oak forests of Germany. And moving carefully through those forests in small family groups are the earliest recognizable Neanderthals. Their ancestors had been in Europe for a long time already, an older human form called Homo heidelbergensis, tall and powerful, hunting big game with wooden spears. But these new people are something refined out of that older lineage, shorter, stockier, better insulated against the cold. Their faces have started to change in the particular way we now recognize instantly in a museum display. The low, wide forehead, the gentle swelling of the brow, the wide nose that warmed incoming breath before it reached the lungs, the solid jaw. You can picture one of those early Neanderthals standing in a patch of afternoon sunlight between two old oaks, listening. That is half of what any Neanderthal life was, listening. Listening to the movement of deer through ferns, listening to the soft complaint of wind bending a branch, listening for the cough of a cave lion a valley over, listening for the voices of their own family, returning from berries or firewood or water. Their ears were human ears, very much like yours, and the landscapes they lived in were alive with sound in a way ours mostly no longer are. No engines, no turbines, no distant highways, just the creaking of old wood, the call of birds, the clatter of loose stones under their own bare or hide-wrapped feet, and, always, the wind. Over the next hundreds of thousands of years, those small family groups spread. They filled Europe from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the mountains of Uzbekistan. They learned every valley and every cave mouth and every reliable spring. They learned which flints shattered cleanly and which did not. They learned which firs kept water out in the rain and which ones only trapped the cold. They learned where mammoths came in late autumn, where reindeer crossed in spring, where ibex sheltered in summer storms. They built an entire library of knowledge about a continent without ever writing a single word. And they carried that library in voices and hands, and the simple act of showing a child how to strike a core at exactly the right angle. Knapping flint, by the way, is not a simple thing. It is not the brutish hammering that older textbooks sometimes implied. A skilled Neanderthal toolmaker, and all of them were skilled because there was no alternative, could look at a rough nodule of flint and see, inside it, the finished blade or scraper or point that lived there. They had developed a technique that archaeologists later named Levallois, after a suburb of Paris where its products were first recognized. In the Levallois technique, the flint worker first prepares the core, shaping it carefully so that a single well-placed strike will detach a flake of almost exactly the size and shape they want. It is a bit like peeling an orange in one spiral, if the orange were made of glass and the spiral had to become a razor. It takes years of practice. It takes a mind that can hold three-dimensional geometry and imagination and convert it to the angle of a blow. It takes patience. It takes teaching and being taught. And that is another thing to sit with quietly. The Neanderthals were teachers. We know this because the tools they made are consistent across enormous distances and enormous spans of time, which means the knowledge was being passed on, generation after generation, child by child, at the hearths of caves. Somewhere, always, there was a grandmother or an uncle or an older sibling showing smaller hands how to hold a hammerstone, how to angle the flint, how to feel for the right resistance, how to listen for the sound of a good strike versus a bad one. Imagine the quiet of those lessons. Imagine the patience of those lessons. Imagine how many failed flakes went into the fire or back onto the cave floor before a child's hands understood what the elder's hands already knew. Imagine the hearths too, because the Neanderthals loved their hearths. That is not a sentimental claim. It is a claim that archaeologists now make carefully based on evidence. Their hearths were not casual arrangements. They built them in specific parts of their caves, sometimes with small stone surrounds, sometimes reused across countless seasons, the soil beneath them stained black and red with the patient layering of fire after fire. Around those hearths, the bones tell stories. Bones of aurochs and red deer and reindeer and horse. Bones of smaller things, too. Birds, rabbits, tortoises, fish. Shells from the coast, even when the coast was a long walk away. Hearths were where food was cooked, where tools were finished, where clothing was repaired, where children were held, where the old people warmed their hands. A Neanderthal hearth, seen from the cave mouth at night, would have looked like a slow orange heartbeat inside a larger body of stone. Let me take you into one of those caves. It is perhaps 100,000 years ago. The exact year does not matter, because nothing depends on exact years in this kind of deep time. You're inside a long, low limestone overhang in what will one day be called France. The entrance is broad enough that daylight reaches about 20 paces in. Beyond that, the light fades to the orange of the fires. The ceiling is low enough that a tall person would need to stoop in some places, though the Neanderthals rarely need to. The air is warmer than it is outside, warmer by several degrees, and it smells of wood smoke and tanned hide and stone that has absorbed countless fires over countless winters. A small group is gathered near the largest hearth, perhaps a dozen people. There is a woman in her 40s, which is old for this world, sitting with her back against a rock wall, her grey-streaked hair tied with a thin strip of hide. She is scraping the inside of a deerskin with a flint tool held in a grip you would recognise instantly, because it is the same grip you use to hold a pencil. Across from her, a younger man is binding a fresh flint point to a spear shaft, using sinew wetted between his teeth and then wrapped tight. Two children are sitting very close together, playing some quiet game with small stones, the kind of game that has no name and no rules, and exists only in the shared attention of two minds. A baby sleeps in a bundle of fur against its mother's chest. An older man, with a limp and a long-healed scar across his forearm, is arranging a small bundle of medicinal plants, yarrow perhaps, or chamomile, herbs we now know they used, into a simple pouch. None of these people look exactly like you, and none of them look exactly like each other, but all of them look like someone you might have met. That is worth saying clearly, because for a long time, popular imagination pictured Neanderthals as shambling brutes, hunched, stupid, grunting caricatures. That picture was wrong from the beginning, and the scientists who first constructed us were working from the skeleton of a single old man who had been badly twisted by arthritis. Actual Neanderthals stood upright. They walked with the easy stride of any other human. They had brains that were, on average, slightly larger than ours. They had language of some kind, though we will never hear what it sounded like. They loved their children and mourned their dead, and sometimes, when the light was right, they looked up at the stars and wondered. We know, for instance, that they buried people, not always and not everywhere, and certainly not in the elaborate ways that later cultures would. But at places like Shanidar, in the mountains of what is now Iraqi Kurdistan, archaeologists have found Neanderthal burials where the body was laid carefully into a shallow grave, curled onto its side, its head supported by a thin layer of stone. At one of those graves, pollen analysis suggested that flowers had been placed around the body, though the interpretation of that particular finding remains debated, and some argue the pollen arrived later, by rodent or by wind. Either way, the bodies themselves tell the story that matters. The dead were handled carefully. They were placed, not abandoned. Someone, tens of thousands of years ago, knelt beside a loved one in a cave and took the time to arrange the limbs gently and covered the body with earth or stone, and then walked slowly back toward the firelight of the living. At Shanidar itself, one of the most haunting finds is an old man who had lived for years with terrible injuries. His right arm had been so badly damaged, very likely in an accident long before, that it had eventually had to be amputated at or below the elbow. He had a crushed eye socket. He walked with a severe limp, and yet he lived into his 40s, at a time when that was a great age, which means the people around him carried him through it. They fed him when he could not hunt. They warmed him when the winters came. They made sure he had a place by the fire. When he finally died, they buried him with the same care they had shown him in life. That is not the behaviour of brutes. That is the behaviour of people who loved each other, and who understood that a life is not measured by how much it can carry. Let your breathing slow a little as you take that in. There is no rush. The old man of Shanidar has been resting for nearly 50,000 years now. He's not going anywhere. And somewhere near him, in the soil that held him, there is still the faint trace of the fire his family built on his last night. Now, come back with me to that first cave, the one in southern Iberia at 40,000 years ago. The man with the eagle talon necklace is still standing at the mouth watching the valley, but we're going to step past him for a moment and look at what the world around him has become. Because by now, after 300,000 years of Neanderthal presence, Europe is not simply a hunting ground. It is a place they have shaped in small, patient ways. Well-worn paths move along certain ridges. Certain caves are known to be good for winter, certain others for summer. Stones for tool-making come from known sources, some of them hundreds of kilometers from where the finished tools are eventually used, which means pieces of that valuable stone were carried for long distances, or traded or exchanged in some slow network of encounters we can only guess at. This is the part of the Neanderthal story that surprises people most when they first hear it. The Neanderthals were not wandering alone across an empty continent. They lived in a woven fabric of relationships. Family groups met each other at certain places, at certain times of year. Young people moved from one group to another, perhaps to marry, perhaps just to join. Tools and ornaments travelled along the same paths. At a cave called Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, small shells have been found, painted with ochre, pierced for stringing, clearly used as personal ornaments, dating to long before modern humans arrived in that region. Meaning the Neanderthals who lived there thought about themselves. They adorned themselves. They looked at their own hands and thought, here is something I could wear. At another site in France there is a carefully carved eagle talon, the kind of necklace our man at the cave mouth wears, that has been dated to many tens of thousands of years ago. The talons had been cut and polished deliberately, threaded to be worn, and recently, deep inside a cave system in southwestern France, at a place called Bruniquel, archaeologists found something even stranger and more moving. A set of circular structures built from broken stalagmites, carefully arranged on the cave floor hundreds of meters from the entrance, far beyond any natural light. Those structures were made by Neanderthals, 176,000 years ago. To build them, a group of Neanderthals had to walk into that cave in total darkness, carrying fire, far enough inside that no outside light could ever reach them, and then they arranged stone into rings. Nobody knows exactly why. Ceremony, perhaps. Shelter, perhaps. Something simply meaningful, which the meaning of has now been lost to time, but whatever the reason, they went deep into the earth, together with fire and made a shape. Let that sit with you for a moment. 176,000 years ago, a group of human beings walked into total darkness, together, with small torches, and arranged pieces of stone into circles for a reason we will never know. The darkness they walked into is the same darkness that is still there now. The stone rings are still there now, and if the cave were to collapse tomorrow and someone were to dig them out 1,000,000 years from now, those rings would still be a record that somebody once cared enough about something to carry fire into the deep dark and build a small shape of meaning. This is the species we are slowly watching fade, at the cave mouth at 40,000 years ago. Not a brutish dead end, not a failed sketch of humanity, a full, thoughtful, long-lived branch of people, with traditions and tools and quiet ceremonies, who had been in Europe for more than 10 times the length of all our recorded history, and who were now very gradually running out of time. Let me slow down for a moment and give you a sense of how long 300,000 years really is, because numbers like that have a way of sliding off the mind without ever quite landing. Imagine a single human lifetime as a single coin. A good long lifetime, 70 years say, is one silver coin placed gently on a table. To stack up the entire span of recorded human history from the first cuneiform tablets in Mesopotamia to the device you are listening to this on, you would need about 70 of those coins stacked up, and the stack would come up to about the height of your hand. That is all of written history. 70 coins. A hand's worth of time. Now imagine stacking coins for the Neanderthals. Not 70, more like 4,000. 4,000 lifetimes, coin on coin, rising from the table and past your shoulder and past your head, and on up to the ceiling of your room, each coin a whole life full of births and deaths and winters and fires, and quiet moments of someone waking up next to someone they loved. That is the pile of time the Neanderthals existed inside. 4,000 lifetimes, one after another, on the same continent, walking the same valleys, teaching the same hands the same grip on the same kinds of stone, No empire in our recorded history has lasted a fraction of that. No language, no religion, no city. The Neanderthals were here longer than any organised human endeavour we have ever built, and they were here gently, without cities, without roads, without any of the noisy fingerprints we tend to leave behind. Think about that next time you are trying to measure the scale of your own life against some older thing. The Neanderthals were not a brief detour in human history. They were most of human history in Europe. We are the detour so far. We arrived recently. We are still in many ways newcomers to the places they knew by heart. And when you walk in the hills of the Dordogne, or through the low scrubland around Gibraltar, or along the limestone ridges of northern Spain, you're walking in a landscape that was known, in a deep and specific way, by people whose bones you might be a short distance from without ever knowing it. The land remembers them longer than the land remembers us. That is a strange, quiet thought to carry at night. Let me tell you too about some of the places the Neanderthals lived, because the places matter. Places always matter. A story about a people without a sense of the specific ground under their feet is a story without weight. So, there is a cave called La Chapelle aux Saints in the Corrèze region of central France, where in 1908 3 priests digging for fossils found the almost complete skeleton of an old Neanderthal man. He had lost most of his teeth years before his death. He had severe arthritis in his hips and lower back. His jaw showed the particular bone loss you see in people whose food has had to be prepared for them, softened and chewed by others, for a long time. He was the same old man whose bent posture gave the world the wrong idea about Neanderthal bodies for most of the 20th century, because the scientist who first reconstructed him assumed that his twisted shape was normal for his species rather than the result of decades of pain. And yet the true story of La Chapelle aux Saints is not about anyone's mistake. It is about the fact that this old man lived into his old age at all. Somebody cut his meat for him. Somebody helped him sit down by the fire. Somebody walked beside him on rough ground. And when he finally died, his people dug a shallow grave in the cave floor and laid him into it, curled gently onto his side and covered him over. 50,000 years later, 3 men in cassocks lifted him out again. The gentleness at both ends of that long span is the thing I want you to hold on to. There is another cave in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan called Shanidar, which I mentioned earlier. Shanidar deserves its own slow paragraph. It is a large limestone cave at the base of a steep valley, and it has been used by humans of one species or another for a very long time indeed. Inside it, archaeologists have found the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals, some of them carefully buried, some of them accidentally preserved by falling stones, all of them deeply thought-provoking. Shanidar 1 is the old man I described earlier, the one with the amputated arm and the crushed eye and the long life his family carried him through. Shanidar 3 was a young adult who had a small puncture wound in a rib that had partially healed before his death. Shanidar 4 was the famous flower burial, the one whose grave soil contained pollen from yarrow, cornflower, groundsel, and other plants, though whether those flowers were deliberately placed or later carried in by rodents is still debated. I lean, quietly, toward believing it was deliberate. I have no proof, only a feeling. But the cave is a place where people cared for each other in life, and the idea that they also cared for each other in death, with handfuls of small yellow and blue and white flowers, fits the shape of the rest of what Shanidar has to tell us. Then there is El Sidron, in Asturias, in northern Spain, a cave that tells a darker and quieter story. At El Sidron, the remains of 12 Neanderthals, adults, adolescents, and children, were found together, all of them having died at roughly the same time about 49,000 years ago. They appear to have been members of a single extended family closely related to each other, and the evidence suggests they died together in a single event that was not peaceful. I'm not going to describe that event tonight, because this is a sleep story, and some things do not belong here. But I will say this. Even El Sidron, with everything it suggests about how hard the very end of Neanderthal life could sometimes be, gives us something unexpectedly gentle. Genetic work on those 12 individuals showed that the adult men were closely related to each other, while the adult women were not, which means the women had likely come into the group from outside, which means, in turn, that Neanderthal groups had a practice of young women moving between families, just as many traditional human cultures throughout later history have done. They were woven together by marriages and by movement. Their world, even at its hardest, had the same shape of kinship and care that ours has. They were not strangers to themselves. And then, far to the north and east, there is Mesmyskaya Cave in the Caucasus Mountains, and Vindhya Cave in Croatia, and Denisova Cave in the Altai. Though Denisova is another story entirely, because it is also the home cave of the Denisovans, the other lost branch of the human family. In each of those caves, a very small number of very late Neanderthals have been identified, some of them among the last of their kind. The genetic work on their bones has shown two consistent things across all of them. Their groups were small, and they were highly related to each other. The family trees had begun to fold inward. Cousins were the only neighbours left. When you read the scientific papers carefully, without the cold language of genetics in the way, what they are actually describing is something deeply human. A handful of families spread too thin across too large a continent, becoming each other's only remaining relatives, watching their numbers slowly drop. I want to stay with that image for a little, because it matters more than the usual headline version of a Neanderthal extinction. The usual version tells you about species being outcompeted, about replacement, about numbers on a graph. Those versions are not wrong. They are just not where the story was actually happening. The story was happening at small fires in small caves, among small groups of relatives, over long stretches of ordinary winters. The story was happening in a grandmother's decision to teach one more child the old grip on the flint, even though there were fewer children than she remembered there being. The story was happening in a young woman's choice to walk 3 valleys over to meet the one other group her family still knew about, because she wanted her own children to have someone to marry one day. The story was happening at bedtime, in the quiet just before sleep, when parents listened to the sound of their own tribe getting smaller and did not have a word for what they were hearing. That is a heavy image, maybe, and I do not mean to weigh you down with it. I want you to hold it only for a moment, softly, and then set it down. Because the other thing that was happening at the same time, in the same small fires and the same small caves, was the ordinary, astonishing fact of life. Meals were being eaten, tools were being made, children were being born, the old people were still telling the old stories, the young people were still teasing each other for falling on ice. The sun was still rising over the same limestone cliffs it had risen over for 100,000 years. For most of those last Neanderthals, most of the time, the day was simply a day. The night was simply a night. They were not mourning the future. They could not. They were simply doing what every human being in every age has done, carrying on, attentively and warmly, inside a world they did not fully understand. Let me take you somewhere a little different for a moment, just to give your mind a new landscape to rest inside. Come with me away from the caves of southern Europe and walk a long way east, across the plains and the low forests and the rivers, until we are standing at the mouth of a different cave. This one is high up in the Altai Mountains, on the border of what we now call Russia and Mongolia. The cave is called Denisova, and it is one of the most quietly astonishing places in the entire story of humanity. Because inside Denisova Cave, over the last 15 years or so, archaeologists and geneticists have found the bones and teeth of 3 different kinds of human beings, who all lived there at different times, sometimes overlapping with each other. Neanderthals lived in Denisova Cave, modern humans lived in Denisova Cave, and a third, previously unknown kind of human, the Denisovans, also lived in Denisova Cave. 3 different branches of our family passing through the same shelter, lighting their own small fires on the same cave floor, sleeping on the same stone, separated only by centuries or millennia, each one adding their dust to the patient layers below. Among the finds at Denisova is a single small bone from a young girl, perhaps 13 years old, who lived roughly 90,000 years ago. When geneticists sequenced her DNA, they found something nobody had expected. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan. She was the child of 2 different human species, and she had lived, briefly, but she had lived. She had been born and presumably fed and warmed and held and taught something, and had been herself for at least 13 years. Before her bone was found, the evidence that Neanderthals and Denisovans had sometimes had children together was theoretical. She was the first direct proof. She was also, in her own small way, a kind of quiet rebuke to the neat categories we like to draw between ancient human species. The categories are real, but they are also porous. The branches of the tree grew close enough to touch each other, and sometimes, when they touched, leaves crossed. She was one of those crossed leaves. Tonight, 45,000 years after the last Neanderthals faded, one of her distant descendants, perhaps someone with a whisper of her DNA still in them, might be listening to this story wrapped in a blanket drifting towards sleep. Deep time does that kind of thing. It keeps its loose ends inside the living. Come back now, slowly, to our cave in southern Iberia. Do not rush. The walk from the Altai is a long one, and the deep past does not travel any faster than we do. Let the mountains of Asia fade behind you. Let the long plains fade. Let the slow pine forests of Eastern Europe fade. Let the rivers fade. And then let the small familiar shape of the limestone cliff rise up again in front of you, with its single dark cave mouth and its single thin thread of smoke rising into the pale afternoon sky. The light has shifted since we left. The sun has moved down behind the ridge on the far side of the valley, and the cave mouth is in full shadow now. Inside, the fire has been stoked, and the oranges and reds of the flames are warmer and brighter against the grey limestone. Our man is inside now. He's sitting on a flat stone near the hearth, working a new piece of hide with a bone scraper, his attention half on the work and half on the two older girls, who are arguing quietly about something small and unimportant near the back wall. The youngest boy is asleep already, curled against his mother's side under a folded wolf skin, his small hand clutched in her hair. The old man with the limp is adding a last piece of dry juniper to the fire. The woman with the shell bracelet is humming a low, slow, wordless tune to herself as she works at another piece of hide across from her husband. The tune has no name we will ever know. It is one of the Neanderthal melodies, simple, patient, descending, that her own mother once hummed in the same way while doing the same kind of work. Outside, the wind has dropped almost to nothing. The cold is settling in without complaint. The sky above the far ridge is turning the particular shade of blue-green that only appears in that thin minute between afternoon and evening. One by one, the small creatures of the valley are finding their places for the night. Hares are pressing themselves into hollows under juniper bushes. A small group of ibex high on the ridge is folding its legs under its bodies on a sheltered ledge. A cave hyena is walking slowly along a distant scree slope on its own errand, and the old man at the fire, without needing to look, senses that something is out there and reaches unconsciously to check that the small children are nearby. Then, just as unconsciously, he relaxes. Everything is where it is supposed to be. The cave is warm. The fire is honest. The people are inside. I want to tell you about food for a moment, because food is one of the things the Neanderthals understood very well, and one of the things the older caricatures got most wrong. The old picture of a Neanderthal tearing raw meat from a bone, all gristle and blood and brute hunger, is almost entirely wrong. The real picture is much more thoughtful and much more varied. We know, from careful chemical analysis of Neanderthal teeth, and from the preserved food residues in dental calculus, that Neanderthals ate a remarkably wide diet. Yes, they ate large game when they could get it. Red deer, reindeer, horse, ibex, aurochs, and sometimes mammoth. But they also ate birds, rabbits, tortoises, shellfish, marine mammals when they lived near the coast, freshwater fish, wild pears, acorns, wild grasses, seeds, mushrooms, and medicinal herbs. They knew their plants. They knew what to pick and what to leave. They knew which bitter leaves helped a sore stomach, and which bark could ease a fever, and which resin could be chewed into something sticky enough to have to stone point to a wooden shaft. At a site called Spy in Belgium, Neanderthal dental calculus, the hardened plaque that preserves microscopic traces of what a person was eating, was found to contain the remains of chamomile and yarrow. Chamomile has a bitter taste, and almost no nutritional value. Yarrow has an even more bitter taste, and even less nutritional value. In other words, the Neanderthals at Spy were not eating those plants because they were hungry. They were eating them because they worked. Chamomile is a mild sedative and digestive calmative. Yarrow has been used as a wound medicine and a fever reducer for as long as humans have kept records of such things. These Neanderthals, living tens of thousands of years before any of the written herbals we inherited from later cultures, had already figured out that certain bitter plants were medicine. Their herbal knowledge was old. Their attention to the quiet chemistry of the living world was old. They were taking care of themselves and each other in ways you would instantly recognize. Picture the old man with the limp back in our cave, reaching into the small pouch of dried herbs he always keeps near his sleeping place, and crumbling a pinch of something dry and grey-green between his thick fingers into a small bowl of warm water. The taste of whatever he drinks is not pleasant. He makes a small face after the first sip, the way a grandparent anywhere in the world makes a small face after a familiar unpleasant medicine. But he drinks it down because it helps his hip when the cold is bad, and the cold is bad tonight. His wife, when she was still alive, used to grind the same plants for him in the same way. Tonight he grinds them for himself, quietly, the way widowed people everywhere grind things for themselves quietly. And then he lies back on his folded furs and waits for the bitterness in his mouth to fade into the wider bitterness of the winter air, and closes his eyes. The light of the fire dances on the low cave ceiling. The children's arguments have stopped. The woman has stopped humming. Our man has set aside his hide scraper and is simply sitting now watching the fire move. Nothing particular is happening. Nothing particular needs to happen. The cave is warm. The winter is outside. The breathing of the people he loves is soft and steady all around him. This is the kind of moment that archaeology almost never recovers, because moments like this leave almost no trace. No bones break, no stones move, no ochre is applied. The fire burns down, the people breathe, time passes, and the record in the soil looks the same either way. And yet, this is where most of Neanderthal life actually lived, in the unremarkable warm hours between the flint knapping and the hunting and the mourning. In the spaces the archaeology cannot see. I think about that sometimes, that most of life never becomes evidence. Most of the minutes of most of the days of most of the billions of human beings who have ever been born have disappeared completely, leaving nothing behind but the quiet genetic nudge of having once been alive. The dramatic moments survive. The beautiful moments sometimes survive. The ordinary ones almost never do. A Neanderthal woman humming her mother's wordless tune over a piece of hide on a winter evening 45,000 years ago is as lost to us as anything can be. And yet, because you are imagining it now, she is also, for a moment, not lost. Every time a living human holds a picture of a dead one in their mind with honest attention, the dead one is, in a small gentle way, remembered. That is not mystical. It is just true. The Neanderthals are inside you tonight because you are thinking about them. When you drift to sleep, they will stay a little while in the quiet corners of your mind, and then they will go. And they will be a little less entirely gone for having been there. What happened? That is the question that has haunted every archaeologist and every geneticist and every curious person who has ever stood in front of a Neanderthal skull in a museum. What happened to them? Why did the Neanderthals end? The honest answer is that no single cause has ever been identified. The honest answer is that the ending was almost certainly a braid of causes, pulled tight over 10,000 years, and that no single strand among them was strong enough alone to kill a species that had already survived so many changes. The weather alone did not do it. The newcomers alone did not do it. Competition alone did not do it. Bad luck alone did not do it. It took all of them, patiently, together. Let us look at the strands, one at a time, in the same slow way our man at the cave mouth would look at a distant herd, noticing each shape taking its measure, moving on to the next. The first strand is the climate. The last 100,000 years of the Ice Age were not a simple long cold. They were a restless heaving thing full of sudden swings. Warmer centuries gave way to colder ones. Open plains would draw down into forests, then retreat again into cold grassland. A valley that had been reliable for 100 generations could, within a few lifetimes, become unfamiliar. For people whose entire survival depended on knowing exactly which animals passed through, which places at which seasons, these changes were a slow, silent pressure. They were not disasters. They were not cataclysms. They were simply the world becoming less predictable, year by year, century by century. Every time the weather shifted, the old knowledge had to be tested again, and sometimes it no longer worked. Sometimes the reindeer no longer came. Sometimes the ibex moved to a different cliff. Sometimes a drought year emptied a familiar spring. A Neanderthal family could survive one bad winter. A Neanderthal valley could survive 5, but across the whole continent, across thousands of years, the small bad winters added up the way small losses always add up in deep time, not as a blow, but as a slow tide. The second strand is population. Neanderthal groups were never large. Their best estimates put the total European Neanderthal population at any one time at something like a few tens of thousands of individuals spread across millions of square kilometres. Their family groups were small, a dozen people, perhaps, rarely more than 20 or 30. Small populations are fragile in a very specific way. When a few people are lost, to an injury, to an accident, to an illness, to a bad year. There are fewer left to carry the old knowledge and to raise the next children. Every loss is heavier. Genetic studies of the last Neanderthals show unusually high levels of inbreeding. The quiet mathematical signature of small numbers stretched thin. The cousins were marrying the cousins because there were simply no other humans in walking distance. That does not mean the Neanderthals were doomed by their own biology. It means that any additional pressure from any direction fell harder on them than it would have fallen on a larger, more widely connected group. The third strand is the arrival. Somewhere around 45,000 years ago, a new kind of human began to appear in Europe. They were taller, more graceful, with flatter foreheads and the small round chins that modern humans still wear. They came from the south and the east, arriving not in a great wave but in a long, slow trickle. Family by family, group by group, they were Homo sapiens. They were us. And they were not, it is important to say, invaders in the cinematic sense. They were not armies. They were not conquerors. They were other people, arriving in a continent that already had people in it, and for a very long time the two kinds of humans simply lived in the same enormous landscape without meeting all that often. When they did meet, the meeting seemed to have been, on the whole, peaceful. We know this because of the ancient DNA. Almost every living person outside of sub-Saharan Africa carries a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, usually between 1 and 2%. The DNA could only have arrived in us if somewhere along the way Neanderthals and modern humans had children together, and those children survived, and had their own children and so on, carrying their Neanderthal grandparents forward in time through us. It was not a single event. It happened many times in many places over many thousands of years, somewhere in Eastern Europe, somewhere in the Levant, somewhere in Western Asia. Somebody from one group and somebody from the other group met and stayed, and raised children together, and those children were loved. That quiet fact is one of the most moving things in all of human prehistory. The Neanderthals did not end only in caves, they also ended in us. But there was still a slow shift happening across the continent. The modern humans had a few small advantages maybe, though the list of those advantages has grown shorter every time archaeologists look closely. For a long time it was assumed that modern humans had better tools. Then it turned out the Neanderthals had tools that were just as sophisticated. For a long time it was assumed that modern humans had art and Neanderthals did not. Then cave paintings were dated that predated the arrival of modern humans in those regions, meaning Neanderthal hands had made them. For a long time it was assumed that modern humans had language and Neanderthals did not. Then the genes associated with human speech were found in Neanderthal DNA, and the structures of their ears and throats and chests were shown to be perfectly capable of producing complex speech. Every time we tried to draw a line between us and them, the line dissolved. The difference, if there was one, was smaller and gentler than we expected it to be. So perhaps the modern humans had slightly larger social networks. Perhaps they traded over longer distances. Perhaps their groups were a little larger, and therefore a little more resilient to a bad winter. Perhaps they had a slight edge in population growth, not because of any great cleverness, but because of small accumulations of luck. In a game played over 10,000 years, a slight edge is enough. Slowly, across generations nobody lived to see the end of. The modern humans became more numerous in Europe, and the Neanderthals became less numerous, and the tide simply moved. Not with a roar, with the patience of weather. Come back now to the cave mouth. Our man is still standing there. The sun has dropped a little lower. The far side of the valley is in shadow. A thin wedge of geese moves across the pale sky, their calls carrying across the distance like small tired horns. He watches them without moving. Behind him, the fire is being fed by a woman whose face we have not seen yet. She's younger than he is, a little. Her hair is the same red-brown, though hers is pulled up into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. She wears a long tunic of softened hide with an edge of fur at the hem. On her wrist is a bracelet of small pierced shells, traded north from the coast a generation ago, and worn by her mother before her. She's adding a length of dry branch to the fire, and the fire answers with a small rise of sparks. There are 3 children still in the cave behind her. That is all. 3 children, where once there would have been 12 or 20, running among 6 or 7 families. The other caves along the cliff are empty now, or very nearly empty. One of them still has a faint trail of smoke rising from its mouth, the sign of another small group, perhaps 2 or 3 people. who visit sometimes. The rest are quiet. The wind runs in and out of them unopposed. The children in this cave are named, though their names are lost. One is a small boy with his father's broad shoulders already showing under his child's tunic. The other two are girls, a few years older, one of them already old enough to have taken her turn at the flint core. The girls are the ones who will have to decide soon whether to stay with their parents in this valley or walk across the long hills in search of another group to join. The old network of winter gatherings has been fraying for 2 generations. Some of the paths their grandmother used to walk are now paths that nobody walks. Last autumn, when the small group from the next valley did not arrive at the expected meeting place, nobody went looking. There was no anger in that, only tiredness, only the understanding that sometimes, now, the meeting places are empty, and you cannot spend the winter looking for what is not there. Feel the quiet of that for a moment. Not a sad quiet, a calm one, the kind of quiet that settles on a house at the end of a long day, when the children are finally asleep and the dishes are put away and the fire is banked for morning. The last generations of Neanderthals were not living in horror. They were living in the slow settling of an old house. They tended their fires, they repaired their clothes, they sang to their children the songs their own mothers had sung. They knapped their flint with the same care, they painted themselves with the same ochre, they buried their dead with the same gentle attention. Most of them, most of the time, did not know they were the last of anything. They were simply living their lives, which is, in the end, what almost every last generation of every lost people has ever done. And yet, some of them surely felt the thinning. A grandmother who remembered the crowd around the autumn fire. An uncle who still talked about the long walk his own uncle had taken to the next valley, where there had been a famous flint knapper with hands so steady he could shape a point in his sleep. A young woman who had expected, when she was small, that her own daughters would have cousins to play with, and who now watched her daughters play alone with pieces of bone. They would have felt it without having a word for it. The old house was quieter than it used to be. The footsteps of certain people no longer came around certain corners. This is one of the things the bones are finally beginning to tell us in very recent years as ancient DNA has improved. When scientists sequenced the genomes of some of the very last Neanderthals, from places like Vindia Cave in Croatia and Mesmyskaya Cave in the Caucasus and a cave at Goyet in Belgium, they found groups that had been small, isolated, and closely related for a long time. Cousins marrying cousins, the same genetic signatures showing up over and over because there was nobody new to bring in. In the very last pockets of Neanderthal Europe, the family tree had started to look less like a tree and more like a braided rope, twisting back on itself. This is not the collapse of a species overnight. It is the slow smoothing of a shore by the tide. It is the gradual emptying of a house, room by room, without anyone ever deciding to leave. And it is also, it turns out, beautiful in a way we did not expect. Because even as the Neanderthals were shrinking, they were still living. They were still painting, they were still hunting, they were still teaching still hunting. They were still teaching their children the careful grip on the flint. The last Neanderthals were not half alive. They were as alive as any of us have ever been. They just happened to be standing at the end of a very long song. Let me paint you a day in the middle of that last long season. It is autumn in the valley. The wind is coming from the north now, colder than the air has been in weeks, and the grasses on the open hillsides have turned the colour of old wheat. Our man is out with 2 others, walking along a ridge that looks down over a curve in the river. They are looking for sign of ibex or of the reindeer that sometimes cut through this country in autumn, or of anything at all. They walk slowly, not because they are tired, but because slowness is how you see. Every dozen steps they stop and listen, and let their eyes move across the landscape the way a skilled reader lets their eyes move across a page. They are reading the world, and the world is, as always, full of small signs. There, a loose stone, flipped over, showing its darker side. Something passed that way in the last day or 2. There, a patch of flattened grass in a dip between 2 rocks. A deer lay down there, recently enough that the grass has not sprung back. There, a faint track, half in dust, half in old frost, leading toward the pine edge. Too small for ibex, too large for fox, probably lynx. They do not follow it. Lynx is not what they need today. They pause at a high place and drink from skin flasks of cold river water. They share a piece of dried meat and a strip of root prepared that morning in the cave. Their conversation, if there is any, is quiet and sparse, the way conversation becomes among people who have walked the same ridges for years together. Most of what passes between them is not spoken at all. A glance at a distant smudge on the horizon, a tilt of the head, a nod, a hand raised to indicate a direction. Their language exists, their language is rich, but up here, on the ridge, most of the work is being done in the older dialect of shared attention. They find a small herd of horses in the next valley, moving slowly along the far slope. Not many, 8 perhaps. Enough if the stalking goes well. Enough anyway to be worth the long, slow walk to get closer. They spend the next 2 hours becoming part of the landscape, flattening behind boulders, easing through low juniper, testing the wind with a thumb wet against their mouth. They do not hurry. They cannot hurry. Hurry is the enemy. Hurry scares horses. They have known this since they were 5 years old and following their own fathers on their own first ridges. They move at the pace of patience. Tonight we're not going to follow them into the hunt itself. The details of that would break the quiet of this journey, and the point of this story is not the violence but the life around it. Let us simply say that the 3 men come back to the cave before full dark, tired and satisfied, with meat enough to share with the rest of the family for several days. The children run to meet them. The women call softly in greeting. The old man with the limp, who does not go out on the ridges anymore, takes the first long smell of the cool evening air off their cloaks and smiles, because he can remember what that air used to feel like against his own skin when he was the one coming home. They eat by the fire. They do not eat in silence, but neither do they eat in loud talk. There is a soft running conversation about the horses and the ridge and the lynx track, and some teasing of the youngest of the 3 men because he slipped on a patch of ice on the way up. There is a laugh or two. The children fall asleep leaning against the grown-ups closest to them. The fire pulls lower and lower, and its warmth reaches farther and farther back into the cave because the outside air has gone cold. At the mouth of the cave, a single bright star has come out, low over the dark line of the distant mountains. Our man walks to the cave mouth one more time before he sleeps. He stands there with his hand resting lightly on the stone, the way you might stand at a window in your own home, and he looks out at the same valley he was looking at when we first met him. The wind has dropped. The sky has deepened to a clear, cold, uncomplicated dark. He watches one more star come out, and then another, and then the slow silver shoulder of the rising moon. He does not think about his species ending. He does not think tonight about anything very specific at all. He is tired, and the fire is warm behind him, and the people he loves are inside the cave asleep, and the world is quiet. He turns, eventually, and walks back inside, and lowers himself onto a bed of folded hides beside the banked fire and closes his eyes. We're going to leave him there for a while. Let him sleep. He has earned it. While he sleeps, I will tell you a little more about what the science now knows about the very end, because the end is both more and less than the popular version has ever suggested. For a long time, the assumption was that the Neanderthals disappeared as a species about 30,000 years ago. That date, rounded and memorable, sat in the textbooks for decades. But as the methods improved, as radiocarbon dating became more precise, as ancient DNA could be extracted from smaller and smaller bone samples, as old museum specimens were re-examined, the date began to shift. The last Neanderthals, it turned out, had held on longer in some places than in others. A cave in Iberia called Gorham's Cave near Gibraltar produced evidence of Neanderthal habitation that seemed to extend closer to 28,000 years ago, though that date has been argued about ever since. Other sites in the far south and far east of Europe held on to their Neanderthals longer than the Central Plains did, because the new modern humans reached those places last. What this means, in practical terms, is that the Neanderthals did not all end at the same moment. They ended in a long, slow, uneven retreat, pushed back, or, more gently, simply outlasted, from north to south and from east to west, until the last pockets were clinging to the warmest, most protected edges of the continent. Southern Iberia, the Mediterranean coast, a few deep valleys in the Caucasus. In those refuges for a little while longer, the old fires still burned. The children were still being taught the old grip on the flint. The old songs were still being sung, though there were fewer and fewer people to sing them. And then, in each of those refuges in turn, the last fire went cold. Not dramatically, not all at once, just the way an old hearth goes cold at the end of a long winter when the people who tended it are no longer there to feed it. The question of who the last Neanderthal actually was is, of course, unanswerable. There is no bone labelled the last one. There is no grave where we can stand and say, "Here, The species ended here. There is only a scatter of very late dates at a handful of sites and the slow fading of the signal in the soil. What we can say with reasonable certainty is that somewhere, perhaps in a cave near Gibraltar, perhaps in a rock shelter in the Caucasus, perhaps in a valley whose name was never recorded by anyone, some individual Neanderthal was the last of their kind. They did not know they were the last. They might have been a child, orphaned and wandering, who simply did not live to grow up. They might have been an old woman sitting by a small fire at the mouth of a familiar cave with nobody else left in the valley. They might have been a middle-aged hunter who went out one morning to look for deer and never came back, and whose body was covered by snow before any other human being could find it. We will never know their name. We will never know their face. We will never know what the last thing they looked at was. The sky, the fire, the inside of their own closed eyelids. What we do know is that they were real. Not a symbol, not an idea. A real person, with the same kind of breathing you are doing now, with the same kind of tiredness at the end of a long day, with the same kind of warmth when a fire was near. They had memories. They had favourites among the people they had loved. They had a particular way of holding their hands when they were thinking, and somewhere, at some moment, for the very last time in the history of the earth, that particular way of holding those hands was performed by a member of Homo neanderthalensis. After that moment the gesture was gone, not hidden, not buried, simply not made again by anyone, ever. Let that rest on you for a while, not as grief, as wonder. The world is so full of patterns that pass through it once and are not seen again. The last Neanderthal gesture, the last Neanderthal word, whatever it was, the last Neanderthal joke heard only by 2 or 3 people around a fire and then forgotten inside them, the last Neanderthal lullaby sung to a child who did not live to grow up, or who did grow up but whose own children were half something else. Every single one of those lasts was also a small full universe, and every single one of them mattered to the people inside it, and every single one of them ended quietly, like a fire that has simply finished burning. Now let us step even farther out from the cave. Imagine looking at Europe from high above, as though from the perspective of some quiet thing with infinite patience. Imagine watching the last 10,000 years of the Neanderthals play out in fast motion, except with the sound turned down low, so that the only thing you can hear is the slow breathing of the continent itself. You would see small points of warm orange light, fires in caves, hearths under overhangs, scattered unevenly across the whole expanse. Early on there are many of those points. They move and shift across the seasons, some going out as a group moves on, new ones appearing where they stop. The map from above twinkles like a slow field of fireflies. As the 10,000 years go on, you would notice, without being told, that the fireflies are thinning, not dramatically, not all at once, just, little by little, the edges of the pattern pulling inward. The fires in the far north go out first, as the cold pushes south and the new humans settle the rivers. Then the fires in the central plains thin, as the new humans spread through the old deer forests. Then the fires in the mountains thin, as the last groups move down to lower, warmer ground. Near the very end, the only fireflies left are clustered in the far south, and in a few deep valleys, and even those are blinking out one by one, week by week, as the last of their keepers die of old age or of illness or of nothing in particular, until, at last, you're watching the continent in the dark, and somewhere down there, a single small point of orange light is the last one. And then it too is quiet. There is no sound when it happens, no bell, no trumpet. The wind is doing what the wind always does. The stars are doing what the stars always do. The river in the valley is still running, though it has begun to freeze at its edges. The herd of horses on the far slope is still moving across the cold grass. Nothing announces the ending, because nothing in deep time ever announces anything. The last Neanderthal closes his eyes, and on the other side of those closed eyes the story simply finishes. And somewhere else, far away, an early modern human baby is being held close by its mother in a different cave, and the world, which has lost one of its human branches tonight, goes on holding the other one. Breathe with that for a moment. Feel your own breath doing what the wind is doing, steady and slow and old. Feel the weight of the blanket if you're under one. Feel how warm your hands are. Our man at the cave mouth, that long-ago man with the eagle talon necklace and the red-brown hair and the scarred knuckles, he is long gone, and yet something of him is still here, tonight in you. Remember that 1 to 2% of Neanderthal DNA that most of us outside sub-Saharan Africa carry? It is not a neat single piece of code. It is a constellation of small sequences scattered across our genomes, each one doing something, or maybe nothing, or maybe something we have not yet noticed. Some of those sequences are involved in how we metabolize certain fats, in how our skin reacts to sunlight, in the shape of particular bones, in how our immune systems recognize certain kinds of infection. Some of them are silent, some of them are perhaps not silent at all, and we have simply not yet learned how to listen to them. In that small way, the Neanderthals are not extinct, not all of them. A tiny thread of them, a thread woven through us, has continued forward, carried by the very children those long ago meetings produced. When you felt a particular kind of cold this winter, a cold that went into your bones in a way that was almost familiar, that might have been a Neanderthal inheritance humming gently inside you. When your skin tanned or refused to tan in the summer sun, the same might be true. When your immune system shrugged off a small cold that could have been worse, a Neanderthal gene might have been part of the quiet defense. They did not leave through the front door, they left through a side door, and on their way out they put a small piece of themselves into the ones who were staying. That is a gentler ending than the one the textbooks used to tell, and it is, as far as the evidence can show, closer to the truth than the story of wars and replacements ever was. The last fire in the last cave did go cold, but the genes kept walking. Let us come back one more time to the cave in southern Iberia. It is the middle of the night now. Our man is asleep. The fire is low, a soft, pulsing red in the deeper dark. The children are bundled together against their mother, their breathing soft and even. The old man with the limp is snoring quietly, a familiar sound the rest of them sleep through, the way you sleep through a clock in your own home. Outside, the sky's full of stars, the same stars you sometimes look up at, though in slightly different places because over 40,000 years the constellations have drifted. The Big Dipper back then looks almost the same as it does now, a long, slow spoon pouring its invisible contents across the north. The Pleiades are there, small and tight. Orion, the hunter, is there, standing up in the southern sky, his belt of 3 stars catching the cold. If you were to climb to the top of the cliff above the cave and stand in the night wind, you would see no other fires anywhere in the valley below, not one. The wind would move through the pines and make that dry, brushing sound it always makes. The river would answer, somewhere far off, a thin, cold line of running water. Overhead, the whole great wheel of the sky would turn slowly, the way it has been turning for billions of years, indifferent and patient. And below you, inside the limestone, there would be just this one small fire, and these few sleeping people, and the slow, steady breath of a species finishing its long, long song. They do not know they are the last. They might be. They might not be. There might be other groups, one in the next valley, one in the valley after that, one clinging on in a coastal cave somewhere to the south. Or there might not. Either way, for this particular family on this particular night, what matters is not the scale of the species. What matters is that their fire is warm, their children are safe, their meat is enough for another few days, and their cave mouth faces the right direction to catch the morning sun. The grand story of Neanderthal extinction is a map drawn from above by us much later. From inside it is just another night, just another sleeping family, just another slow, careful ending in a world full of slow, careful endings. There is something I want you to take with you as this part of the story begins to fade. It is a small thing, but it might be useful if the dark of your own room is feeling like a long dark. Every one of us, every single one of us alive tonight, is the end of a very long line of nights. Our mothers, and their mothers, and their mothers, and their mothers, stretching back through generations and through species, and through whole ages of the earth. Every one of those nights mattered to the people inside them. Every one of those nights had its fire, or its shelter, or its branch, or its body of a mother held close against a body of a child. The last Neanderthal night is one small knot in that enormous rope. Your night tonight is another knot tied later in the same rope. You're not separate from that man at the cave mouth. You're another chapter of the same long story he was also in, and the story keeps going. That is the other quiet thing. The story does not end when a branch ends. A river with a single dry fork is still a river. A tree that has dropped a single limb still grows. The human family lost the Neanderthals, and that loss is real and worth grieving in a small, honest way. But the human family is also still here, and still inside the same slow, unbroken conversation with the cold, and the fire, and the stars that the Neanderthals were inside. You are carrying that conversation forward tonight, whether you meant to or not, by breathing and resting and turning your face toward the quiet. That is, in the oldest sense, the work of any human being, to be a living place where the old fires can be kept warm. Let yourself drift a little with that. Let the cave mouth blur. Let the figure of the man with the eagle talon necklace grow less distinct. He is still there, but you do not have to keep him sharp. He has been sleeping for 40,000 years, and tonight at last he can share the sleeping with you. There are still some small things left to say. Small quiet things, more like the final soft notes of a long piece of music than like a conclusion. Listen if you can. Drift if you need. The first small thing is about the caves themselves. The caves the Neanderthals lived in are in many cases still there. You can visit them if you ever want to. Caves in southern France, in Spain, in Belgium, in Croatia, in Germany, in Iraq, in Uzbekistan. Their ceilings still carry the faint smoke stains of their old fires. Their floors, if you dug down through the patient layers, would still hold in places the broken bone and the broken flint of everyday lives. The Bruniquel rings in southwestern France are still arranged the way they were arranged 176,000 years ago, waiting in total darkness. The Shanidar graves are still in the mountain of their mountain. The paint that Neanderthal hands pressed onto certain cave walls is still there, faint and patient, in the dark. If the species is gone, the traces are not. The second small thing is about the bones. The Neanderthal bones we find today are handled, in good museums and in good labs, with extraordinary gentleness. They are dusted with small, soft brushes. They are stored in controlled air. They are numbered, measured, photographed, and then often returned to a quiet drawer to rest until the next time a question needs asking. In that sense, their people are still being taken care of, though by strangers, and though 40,000 years late. The old man of Shanidar is, in a way, still being looked after. So is the child at La Ferracie. So are the 10 or 12 bodies at El Cidron, a cave in northern Spain whose Neanderthals all came from a single extended family that walked into it together and, for reasons we do not entirely understand, never walked out. Even those, even El Cidron, which is as close to a tragedy as Neanderthal archaeology gets, are handled today with the same care the Shanidar mourners used when they laid their old man in the ground. Across 40,000 years the hands are different, but the care is the same. That matters somehow. It feels like a small note of kindness echoing very late. The third small thing is about the questions that are still open, because most of them are. We do not know exactly why the Neanderthals thinned. We know the climate pushed. We know the modern humans arrived. We know the populations were small. We know the groups were thinly woven. We know all of that. What we do not know is the exact proportion of each strand in the final braid. We do not know how much was weather, how much was competition, how much was simply the long patient bad luck of being small. Scientists have spent decades trying to find the single strongest cause, and every time they chase one, another one reveals itself as equally strong. The honest answer keeps turning out to be all of them, together, slowly. That answer can feel unsatisfying if you want a clean villain. It can feel comforting, though, if you are willing to sit with it, because it means that the Neanderthals were not killed by anything large or evil. They were simply lived out of this chapter of the world by the gentle persistence of time. There is something else I want to slip in here, while the cave fire is still warm and the wind is still soft against the stone, and you are still floating in that place between waking and resting where stories do their best work. I want to tell you about the painted hands, because the Neanderthals painted their own hands onto cave walls tens of thousands of years before anyone thought they were capable of such a thing, and the story of how we found that out is one of the quietest and most moving in all of recent archaeology. For more than a century, the famous painted caves of Western Europe, Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, and dozens of others, were assumed to be the work of modern humans. The paintings inside them were so sophisticated, so graceful, so full of movement and intention, that the idea of Neanderthal painters seemed impossible to the early archaeologists. Neanderthals were supposed to be the brutes. Only Homo sapiens could make art, the story went, and that was part of what made us us. Art was the line. Art was the thing that separated the thinking animal from the merely surviving one. And then, in the last 10 years or so, the dating of certain cave paintings in Spain, at caves called La Pasiega, Maltraviso, and Ardales, produced a result that embarrassed and delighted the field in equal measure. Those paintings, including carefully outlined hand stencils where someone had pressed their palm against the wall and blown red ochre around it, were more than 64,000 years old, which is to say, they had been made more than 20,000 years before modern humans arrived in Western Europe, which is to say, they had been made by Neanderthals. Take that in slowly. 64,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now Spain, a Neanderthal walked into a cave with a mouthful of red ochre and water, placed their hand flat against the cool stone, and blew a fine red mist around their fingers. When they took their hand away, their hand was gone, but the ghost of it was still there on the wall, outlined in a soft red cloud. Then they walked out of the cave. They went home to their fire and their family and their ordinary evening, and their hand stayed on that wall for 64,000 years, waiting patiently in the dark until a team of scientists with very careful equipment climbed into the same cave and found it again. A hand, a single outlined hand made by someone with the same fingers you have, and the same urge you have to leave a mark on a quiet wall and say, in the oldest language there is, I was here. Not I conquered, not I built an empire, not I wrote a book, just I was here. That urge is older than modern humans. That urge is part of the deep equipment of being a thinking primate. The Neanderthals had it. They acted on it. And tonight, somewhere in a cave in Spain, a few of those hands are still patiently present, waiting for the next visitor to come and stand in front of them and say, hello, I see you. If you ever need a small warm thing to hold on to when the dark feels impersonal, hold on to that. 64,000 years ago, another human being left a hand on a wall so that the wall would remember them. The wall has been remembering them ever since. The wall is still remembering them tonight. And somewhere, in the long, patient work of time, every one of us is leaving small, soft outlines of ourselves against the walls of whatever cave we happen to be passing through. You do not have to do anything more dramatic than live to leave those outlines. The Neanderthals did not. They simply were, and they were attentively, and that attention left marks, and the marks have waited patiently for us to notice them. I want to add one more small image before we turn back to the fire. Picture the inside of one of those painted caves today. Picture it in total darkness, because that is how it actually is. Caves deep enough to hold old paintings are caves deep enough that no natural light ever reaches them. The paint on the wall is waiting in the dark. It has been waiting in the dark for so long that the weight has become part of what the paint is. A hand outline in red ochre in a cave in northern Spain has been alone in its darkness for more than 600 centuries. 600 centuries. During all of that time, the hand has been there, and nothing has been looking at it. It has not needed anyone to look at it in order to continue being a hand. It has been patient the way stone is patient. And then, one afternoon in the 21st century, a scientist crawled in with a battery-powered lamp, and the darkness around the hand, for the first time since its maker walked away, was broken by a small moving pool of warm light. The hand, for the first time in 60,000 years, was seen. I cannot tell you why that image makes me feel the way it does, but it does. Maybe it is the thought that some things wait a very long time to be noticed, and still eventually are. Maybe it is the thought that the maker of the hand never knew, and never could have known, that their small private gesture would one day be found, and recognized and cared about by strangers who did not share their language or their species. Either way. The hand waited. The hand was found. The hand is now, gently, in the world again. And the fourth small thing is about what they left us to carry. Not just the genes, though those matter. Also the reminder. Also the example. For nearly 300,000 years, Homo neanderthalensis walked this continent, built fires, raised children, buried the dead, wore ornaments, painted caves, carried stone for long distances, taught younger hands the patient craft of the flint, and took care of one another when they were hurt. They did all of that without writing, without cities, without agriculture, without any of the things our own civilization thinks of as essential. They did it with bodies and voices and attention and love, and the world held them for a very long time, and when the world finally let them go, it did so slowly, as if reluctant. That is not the story of a failed species. That is the story of a successful one whose long good run eventually came to its own quiet ending. Listen, the fire in our cave is almost out now. The old man with the limp is still snoring. The woman with the shell bracelet has turned over onto her side and gathered the smallest child closer against her. The older girls are asleep near the wall, wrapped in a single shared fur. Our man has not moved. His breath is slow and even, and his hands, even in sleep, are resting the way the hands of a patient person rest. Open, relaxed, ready for whatever the next morning will need, but not reaching for it yet. Above the cave, the stars are continuing their long, slow wheel. Below it, the river is continuing its long, slow run. Between them, in a small warm pocket of stone and firelight, the last Neanderthals of this particular valley are resting. That is all they are doing tonight. Resting. You can rest with them. There is nothing left in this story that needs you to stay alert for it. The mystery has been laid out as honestly as anyone can lay it out right now, and science will keep working on the fine details, and the fine details will keep shifting the way fine details always shift, and the overall shape will stay about the same. A long-lived, thoughtful, loving branch of the human family. A slow thinning, a quiet disappearance. A small trace left inside us. An enormous silence afterward, and an enormous amount of night. If you're still with me, let the breath in your chest match the slow rise and fall of the sleeping people in that cave. In, out, nothing to chase, nothing to fix. The last Neanderthal has already closed his eyes. The last Neanderthal closed his eyes 40,000 years ago. In fact, a very long time before you were ever born. A very long time before any of your worries were worth worrying about. Whatever you are carrying tonight, whatever small bright ache you brought to this story when you first pressed play, it is welcome to rest here for a while inside the larger quiet of that ending. The quiet is big enough. The quiet has been big enough for a long, long time. Let the cave grow dim in your mind. Let the figure of the man at its mouth become a soft, dark shape, and then less than a shape, and then just a warm feeling without any outline at all. Let the valley below fade. Let the distant mammoths fade. Let the long grey tiger fade. Keep only the small orange pulse of the dying fire for a little while longer, and then let even that fade, until there is only the memory of having been warm near it. Somewhere in southern Iberia, at 40,000 years ago, an old fire went cold and nobody noticed, because the people who would have noticed had all closed their eyes for the night. Somewhere in the future, tonight, you're about to close your eyes for the night too. In between those two moments is a long, long, gentle stretch of human time, mostly forgotten, mostly unrecorded, mostly just people living their own quiet lives between their own quiet fires. You are the furthest end of that stretch so far. You are, in that sense, one of the great, great, great grandchildren of that cave. Every breath you take is a continuation of the breathing that was happening there. You are not separate from them. You are the next part of the sleep. Rest now. The mystery will still be there in the morning. The cave will still be there in the morning. The bones of the old man at Shanidar will still be resting in their careful grave in the morning. The stone rings at Brunichel will still be standing in their total darkness in the morning. The 1 or 2% of Neanderthal DNA inside you will still be humming quietly along in the morning, doing whatever small work it does. Nothing of this ending needs you to hold it together. You can let go of it now. You can let go of all of it now. The fire has been banked, the hides have been pulled up, the old breath is moving in and out, and the night is big and kind and ready to take you with it. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Breathe slowly. Let the last Neanderthal, and the woman with the shell bracelet, and the old man with the limp and the 3 children, and the quiet fire and the dark valley and the rising moon and the turning stars all settle around you like a thick, soft, very old blanket. They have been waiting a long time to hold someone. They're glad it is you tonight. Sleep well, traveller. The story is over. The story, in another sense, is never over. And the quiet in this cave, in this valley, in this small warm pocket of the human family will still be there when you wake.